everybody, my name is Barnaby Baker and I am ExPreacher. And it's awesome to have you here today. Firstly, I just really want to thank you all for joining with me in this exciting event as I'm finally able to reveal myself to you. A little later on this broadcast, I'm going to be answering your questions. So if you have a question, please just type it in the comments and I will answer them for you. So for the past 4 years, I have been communicating to you as simply ExPreacher. I've written books and blogs under this name, and for most part, hidden my real identity from the majority of you. Of course, there have been quite a few people on the page who do know me, because it's important that I have that recognition, I guess, to help other people when people were saying, are you really who you are? How do we know you're not just making all this up? So obviously, there is some of you who do know who I am. And for those of you, thank you for your support. Thank you for everything that you have done. But my reason for being anonymous was basically to protect myself and certain family members from undue persecution and also the constant demands for repentance and people praying for me to come back to God, and also some threats by former colleagues, church members, and of course trolls that do troll this site. And this has been something that I have been successful at avoiding for some time. But now I feel it's time for me to stop being anonymous. I feel that being anonymous serves very little purpose, and if anything is actually hindering my ability to help those leaving their faith and those who are involved in church life yet no longer believe. I also have several new books coming out shortly, and I'm currently finishing the third book in the Crazy Things Christians Believe series, because let's face it, the majority of it has been absolutely crazy. So we're doing the third book, which is obsessed about hell. I'm going to be talking about the reality of hell, or actually the non-existence of hell, I should say, and dealing with that whole topic in that book. Hopefully that's going to be coming out late this month, perhaps early June. Keep watching. For that, I will be releasing, obviously, some very special previews of that to you as well. So I'm also going to be re-releasing all of my books under my real name and obviously updating a lot of the content. So the content's going to be slightly updated. So if you already have a copy of the books, I think Amazon give you a free update if I update them. If not, then go ahead and get those books. Wait for me to update them though, because I'm going to be adding quite a few things to a lot of those books. So a part of my decision has come about due to the fact that I really want to be doing regular video blogs and also live broadcasts on this page for you guys. And also I have created a parody character called Reverend R.J. Williams. Reverend R.J. Williams is a Pentecostal evangelical preacher from the Midwest who finds obscure scriptures that most pastors just simply will not cover, and he covers these scriptures in a very humorous way. I'm also going to be doing a regular broadcast of Reverend R.J. Williams, so keep an eye out for that. I have done a pilot program for that, and the response on that was very good. So people found it very humorous, and I think you will too. So hopefully R.J. Williams will be bringing you a message every single Sunday. All right, well, let me start a little bit about my background. So I was born in England. My parents were Brian and Valerie Baker, who already had 2 children of their own, my sister Penny and my big brother Philip. And Mum and Dad had quite the rocky marriage in England, and my dad was a very successful businessman, decided to retire at the age of 38 and move our family to New Zealand, basically to start a new life. Shortly before leaving England, though, which was in 1972, some wonderfully kind neighbours, as neighbours can be this way, introduced them to Jesus. And wasn't that a wonderful, exciting adventure? So there my parents were all of a sudden introduced to this amazing character called Jesus, who would, it was promised, solve all of their problems. Well, it actually probably just caused a lot more. But at the time, my dad was afraid of flying, so we travelled to New Zealand by ship. And that was a 6-week journey. During the voyage, we attended the church meetings on the boat and then arrived in New Zealand. Once we were settled in New Zealand, we settled in a little place called Waipu in New Zealand, and we started attending the local Assemblies of God Church, which was a charismatic, Pentecostal, evangelical, crazy house. And my dad decided he wanted to start a Christian bookstore. So during all of this time, I was about 4 or 5 when we got to New Zealand, and that's when my indoctrination, I guess, started. Was at that age learning all things to do with Christianity. And so my indoctrination started there, and my dad started a Christian bookstore. And in 1979, he went to a booksellers convention in the United States, in a little place called Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he was introduced to the faith message. And he was also introduced to Kenneth Hagin and Rhema Bible Training Center. And he suddenly got convinced that we needed to attend the Bible school, move to America and attend that Bible school. So we did just that. We moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where my mum, dad, and older brother Philip all attended the Bible school and learned about the prosperity message and the faith message. And shortly after graduating, mum and dad felt God was telling them to go to Australia and take Australia the word of faith. So in 1981, we moved to Australia, purchased a caravan, and started traveling around the southwest of Australia conducting faith seminars. I was around 12 at the time. I operated the sound and lighting equipment. My sister Penny and my mum were the music team. And we would go from literally town to town preaching the faith message. Sometimes, 3 or 4 people would show up. Sometimes 100 or so. But this is how we started out in the ministry. And after several months, Dad felt the Lord telling him to hasten to the city of Perth and commence a work there. So we moved to Perth, where we started a church called Inner City Faith Fellowship. This church grew to several hundred people, and we soon took over a building in Northbridge, started a Christian school and a Bible school. And after a while, the congregation grew more than 1,500 people. And so we had to move again into a very large building. It had about a 4,000-seat auditorium in Burswood. The church and Bible school became a Rhema church and a Rhema Bible Training Center. We had Kenneth Hagin come out and do one of our graduations, and he was so impressed with everything. He said, look, we've got to make this a Rhema, and so that's what happened. So when I was about 16, I started going on mission trips, and I was preaching in churches in Indonesia. I was an assistant youth pastor with the church, and in 1987, I went alone to South Africa. I moved to South Africa and attended the Rhema Bible Training Center in Johannesburg with a close family friend of mine, Ray McCauley, who was the pastor of that church. That church was around about a 7,000 or 8,000 member church at the time. There was about 300 people in the morning Bible school and about 500 at the night time. It was absolutely amazing to be there. And after my graduation from that, I returned to Perth and worked in the youth department. Later that following year, I did a world trip with my dad. And we were preaching in churches, and it was actually the last time that my dad and I preached together, was that year. And we traveled all around the world. We preached in like England and some churches in Europe, and then mostly in the United States. And so we were preaching in churches throughout the United States. My dad actually left earlier than I did because I had some additional speaking engagements. And by the time I got back to Australia, my mum and dad told me that they were leaving the church and leaving their marriage. My dad was resigning. He was handing the church over to my older brother, Philip. And, I kind of had a bit of an issue with that at the time. I realized their marriage had always been rocky throughout the years. My dad had some issues, which later came out, which I'll talk about maybe in another episode or later on in this one. But the church was around about 6,000 members, and my brother Philip took that over. He renamed the church Riverview, which is still there today. Those of you that are watching from Australia probably have heard of Riverview Church. That's my brother's church, or was my brother's church. Meanwhile, I got married. So I was 21 years old. I got married to a lovely girl in the church who was also an amazing piano player and singer. And I felt called of God to start a church in the city of Rockingham, which is about 45 minutes away from Perth. This church grew to several hundred people, and while I was doing that, I actually started a second church in North Perth. So I was pastoring 2 churches. I had associate pastors that were, sharing the teaching with me and the preaching with me. I also continued traveling. I was still traveling to Singapore. I was preaching for Joseph Prince. Back then it was New Creation Church. In fact, I started preaching for Joseph Prince when he just had like 200 young people. It was basically just a youth group. And I continued preaching for him right up until, he had like 7,000, 8,000 members in his church today. I think it's like a 21,000 1,000 member church, huge, very successful church there. And so I was preaching in that church on a very regular basis, traveling through Indonesia, preaching there as well, New Zealand, and of course here in the USA. And the demand for me to preach in other churches grew and grew. People wanted me to attend their conferences and speak at their conferences, speak in their churches, do seminars for them. And so I, after 7 years of pastoring, handed the churches over to my associates. And I moved to the Gold Coast, where my wife Louise at the time became the worship leader for the local Rhema church there on the Gold Coast. Eventually, I became more and more involved in the church as well. I was still traveling, but still got very much involved there. And eventually I became the associate pastor for that church. And that church grew from like 300 people to around 3,000 members, 2,500 plus members when I left. But traveling, being away from my family certainly took its toll on my marriage. And I realized my marriage was collapsing. I have 2 beautiful children from that marriage, very amazing kids. Part of the reason why I was anonymous was because those kids are still obviously involved in church life, and I didn't want them to, be the target of anything. So that was certainly part of it. They're a lot older now. They can understand things a little bit more clearly. And so I feel coming out now, it's not going to affect them as much. So my marriage started collapsing. I started to have some real doubts, which I'll go into here in a second. But I had some real doubts about why I was doing what I was doing, why I even believed some of the things that I was believing. And so I stepped down from the ministry and also left the marriage. And for the next few years began to research why I believed what I believed. And eventually came to the conclusion that there simply is no God. That basically everything I'd placed my faith in was nothing more than man-made stories and myths to make us feel good about life and to make us understand certain things. But in reality, I discovered none of it was real. I moved to the USA for a job opportunity back in 2009. I've been living in the United States ever since. I was newly married at the time to a girl I've been seeing for 4 years then, and I've been here since 2009. So that marriage recently collapsed, so not having a lot of success with marriages. Maybe I'm just not the marrying kind. I don't know. Could be that. But one of the main questions that I'm often asked is what actually caused me to stop believing? What caused me to come to that realization where I started to really question my faith and started to question these things? And it was not something that happened overnight. Obviously, I'd been involved in church life since I was very, very young. I've been preaching, and I was very passionate. I really believed what I believed. Sometimes people say, oh, did you just not believe it and just making it all up and pretending? And I was like, no, I genuinely believed that, the Bible was true. I believed everything about it. And committed Christians simply don't wake up one day and turn their back on God. It requires a catalyst, if you will. It requires something to happen that causes them to start questioning, causes them to start doubting their faith. And usually we face an event, or in my case, a series of events, which cause us to start this questioning of our faith. And the questions cause us to reason with ourselves. And they cause us to really start asking, pertinent questions about why we still believe, or why we still want to cling to these things. And, those questions will either nullify or justify our faith. And I think a lot of times people start questioning and then slip back into believing again. And then they'll start questioning again and then slip back into believing again. And it's this journey that goes back and forth, sometimes for years, sometimes for just months. I was one of those guys that did it for about 10 years. So, it was a very different experience for me. But when you do start honestly questioning the basic beliefs of your faith, you find that there are more questions, not necessarily answers. And one of the greatest flaws with Christianity is that we're taught not to question anything. This, of course, is the total opposite to what you find in science or any other form of further education, where you are taught to question absolutely everything. But when you do start honestly questioning the basic beliefs of your faith, you start asking questions of yourself. And this is the dilemma of faith. Given the overwhelming lack of any real evidence, it can only be believed and adhered to if you have faith. And one of the good definitions of faith that I like to coin is that it is a feeling. Faith is a feeling that transcends facts and evidence. Nearly every Christian undergoes some form of initial doubts early on in their walk with God. Usually these doubts are quelled by mature Christians or church leaders who inform us that if we knew more about the nature of God, or when the Holy Spirit is fully formed in you, you wouldn't bother with such questions. But by that time, we're usually at a place where we admire or hold in high esteem these people and simply take them at their word. So not wanting to appear foolish or ignorant in front of people, we simply stop asking questions and continue to believe. We're told that God will continue to reveal himself through us, through his word, through prayer, spiritual leaders, pastors, teachers. We're discouraged by these same leaders from reading secular books, from watching documentaries that may challenge our faith, because they feel that questioning our faith is not healthy, it's not good for us. But in reality, we should be questioning absolutely everything. But provided we have enough spiritual and emotional experiences with God, we simply keep on believing and growing in our faith. From an evangelical point of view, most of these experiences are characterized by statements like, oh, I feel the presence of God, or I feel so close to God, or I feel the power of God, or I saw God move in that person, or God really used that person to speak to me. And these are emotional experiences that usually far outweigh any initial doubts that we have. After all, the emotions and the feelings we experience are real, right? At least this is what we're told and led to believe. So early questioning is usually from simple doubts that are not significant enough to overcome the emotions experienced by our belief or faith. They're just the questions of what Paul referred to as a babe in Christ in Corinthians. So it's a babe in Christ, somebody who doesn't really know much. They don't know a lot, but maybe they have some questions, but then these questions are easily quelled by mature believers. And as a result, it's easy for others to persuade us to push these questions to the back of our minds. And so that's exactly what we do. We push everything to the back of our mind and we go, oh, hallelujah, life's good, and I'm believing God for my marriage, and I'm believing God for finances, and I'm doing this, and I'm working at this, and I'm going to church, and I'm doing all these wonderful things. So it's got to be right, because all these people can't be wrong, right? I mean, you're in a congregation with 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 other people. You can't all be wrong. Well, each denomination and each individual church within that denominational group does have a defined subculture that we find ourselves exploring and discovering with every passing week, every month, every year. We soon discover the words that are acceptable and the words that aren't acceptable. We discover that actions, some will be praised and others will be corrected. And so we begin to alter our actions and we begin to alter our words to suit the environment that we're in. For instance, some churches are very liberal on subjects like drinking wine or watching TV, dating, telling jokes, playing video games, sexuality, sports. Others are far more strict concerning some of those things, even condemning them as ungodly or of the devil. So as we change to conform to our local church beliefs, this innate desire for acceptance flows through our Christian experience and our relationships, not only our relationship with God, but also those around us. The desire to fit in, to be accepted and feel part of this subculture becomes a significant part of our Christian life. We want to please our leaders and we want to please those we recognize as being far more spiritual than us. We are subtly, or in some cases not so subtly, persuaded that the word of God and that word of our pastors and the word of our spiritual advisors is simply not to be questioned. So, thanks to all that Christian love and guidance, the first stage of doubt may take many, many years to evolve. And maybe you've got friends and loved ones that are in that situation. They've been involved in church life for years. And so they don't have those same doubts that you do. They don't have those same questions that you do. But hopefully, I'll be able to help you show them that it's time to start questioning these beliefs. It's time to start asking ourselves some very, very serious questions. Because it's only when we start asking questions do we really start walking along the path to reason, leaving faith towards reason. And so the early discovery of small inconsistencies and experiencing the frustration of unanswered prayer actually does very little to sway our faith. I'm sure you've got friends and loved ones who you're like, you know that you prayed for this last week and it hasn't happened. Or, you know, a year ago you wanted this to happen and you prayed and still hasn't happened. Well, those things do very little to sway their faith simply because we're taught as Christians, if things aren't working out, it's our lack of faith, not God's ability to act. And so rather than looking deeper into these things, we simply take the blame, assuming the fault is purely with us. Can't be God. After all, he created the world, right? It's got to be us. We're the ones, somehow my faith's not strong enough. Somehow maybe I should have gone to that prayer meeting. Maybe I should have gone to that extra church service. Maybe I should have given a little bit more in that offering. Whatever it is, we simply take the blame and we strive and work even harder to please God in a vain attempt to have stronger faith. We overlook the times when it seems prayer's not working. We overlook the inconsistencies we discover in nature and the character of God. We ignore the obvious mythological nature of the Bible stories we read, taking them as absolute fact. The story of creation. How ridiculous. To believe that the world is 10,000 years old is the most crazy, retarded thing anybody could believe. Yet, here in the United States, millions of people believe that the creation story is absolutely true. Adam and Eve were in a garden, a snake talked to them, and God put a tree in the garden. You know, it's funny when I think about that story. You know, we should be thanking that snake. Absolutely we should be. Because the snake was at least wanting them to know the difference between good and evil. So anyway, the story of Noah's Ark. To believe that all the animals that we have in the world today actually fitted on a boat. And the world was flooded. The entire world was flooded. Not to, break anybody's bubble here, but you realize that the Chinese culture were writing during, before, and after the supposed flood. So it couldn't have been a worldwide one, right? But we don't think of these things. We ignore historical evidence and we believe the biblical history, which is so flawed it's ridiculous. The Tower of Babel. We actually believe that man built a tower that reached the heavens. And the whole reason we have all these languages today in the world is because God came down and confused their language so they wouldn't understand each other and they scattered to the four corners of the earth. How ridiculous. But we believe that. We believe that Jonah was swallowed by a whale or a big fish and that he was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and then spewed up in the land so that he could go and preach to the people. We don't question these things, and yet they're clearly myths. They're clearly just crazy stories. They cannot, simply by the mere nature of themselves, possibly represent fact. And yet the desire to please others drowns out this voice of reason, drowns out the voice of rationality. At some point, however, in our Christian walk, the voice of reason starts to get loud enough to pay attention to. One day, something happens that triggers a series of questions. Questions that were trying to get our attention all along, but we just never were open to them. I remember when I was attending Bible school in South Africa, I became friends with a girl who sat next to me in class. And one day, the associate director of the Bible school came and called me into his office. And he had, a sad look on his face. And he informed me that this beautiful girl, young 22-year-old girl, had been killed in a car accident on her way to the Bible school. A truck with a big container on the back had lost its load, it had landed on her car, and she was killed instantly. At the time, I remember I questioned how God could have let this beautiful girl, who wanted nothing more than to actually serve God in the ministry, be killed while driving to Bible school. I mean, she wasn't driving to a bar. She wasn't driving, to do something horrible. She was driving to the very house of God to learn more about God. And yet God was somehow powerless to stop her from being killed. Caused a question, a big question. Why in the prime of her life was she taken? My lecturers at the time said something along the lines, none of us knows exactly what was in her heart. Perhaps she had some hidden sin that allowed the devil to take advantage and kill her. And received similar responses from my Christian friends. However, deep down, I could never quite reconcile the idea of this sweet girl having some hidden sin so great as it for her to cost her life. If God was truly God, how could he let this happen? But of course, because I had respect for teachers and advisors, I pushed these doubts further to the back of my mind and simply kept believing that God had a plan for all of us and he was still in control. And here's the thing, the many experiences and the feelings you have regarding your relationship with God always overcome these little doubts. We conclude that there are things we don't know and continue believing. We continue to attend the prayer meetings, the worship services. We continue to give our money, and we continue to think we feel the presence of God. So the more spiritual experiences we have, the greater our conviction becomes. Our doubts give way to commitment, and the things of God fill our hearts and minds once more, pushing reason further and further away. You hear Christians make statements like, I know in my heart that God is real. No matter what facts you provide, I won't change what I believe. And you know, I was like that. I was dogmatic about my beliefs. Even when I was presented with facts to the contrary to those beliefs, the experiences I had, the feelings, the emotions outweighed everything else. But once in a while, we do encounter an event that surpasses these feelings. I had already experienced one such event. Then, many years later, there was another one that was instrumental in reinforcing my later doubts. And that was the tragic death of my associate pastor's son. This boy was a great kid, strong Christian, prayed, worshipped, did everything right. Go to church all the time. I mean, he was a good kid. This guy was not a bad or rebellious kid. He was like a big brother to my own children. And he was killed in a devastating car accident along with 2 other boys from the church. A 4th boy narrowly survived the accident but suffered the loss of both of his legs, and I was devastated. And over the following months, the thoughts of his death plagued me. I wanted to know, how could God let this happen once again? Why didn't God do something to stop the accident? Why didn't an angel rescue them, stop them from hitting that tree, going out of control? I experienced the death of others close to me before. I hadn't had those questions. So why was this situation affecting me so much? What was happening to me? I felt like I was missing something at the time. I couldn't really put my finger on what it was. But there's one thing I did know. All those boys from the church were dead. Good kids. Way too young to die. And we believed in a God who protects us. We believed in a God who preserved our lives. But somehow something went wrong. Families altered forever. Good Christian families that deserve better. Why do bad things happen to good people? Was a question that constantly started coming up in my life. So I started wondering if statistically good things happen to Christians, or more good things happen to Christians than non-Christians. And I started looking at statistics and just going through books and scrolling through the internet to try and find out. And you know what I found out? They don't. Better things don't happen to Christians than non-Christians. Tragedy strikes everybody. Good things happen to everybody. We all have good days. We all have bad days. It doesn't make any difference whether you believe in God, Allah, Buddha, or you're an atheist like me. It doesn't make any difference. You're going to have good things and you're going to have bad things happen in your life. It's just life. So all the prayers, all the fasting, all the Bible reading, basically doesn't make one bit of difference. What happens in life is the result of the decisions we make combined with a multitude of random, serendipitous events. And so the questions I had when my friend in Bible school, who died all those years earlier, rose once again to the surface to join and reinforce my current doubts and questions. And slowly over time, all the things I'd questioned in the past started to bubble to the surface. And as a result, I started noticing even more inconsistencies. And I started questioning absolutely everything. The more I opened my eyes, the more I began to really consider my beliefs. More events, unanswered prayers, and the struggles I saw in others worked together in my mind to reinforce my doubts. One event on its own does not convince us to explore doubts, but experience a number of them does. I had somebody write on my Facebook page the other day when I posed this question, and I said, is it one thing that caused you to leave? And one person said, no, it was more like a death by 1,000 cuts. And it is. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. And the moment you start opening your mind, and the moment you start realizing that it's the voice of reason, not the devil, trying to convince you to ask questions, it's the voice of reason that's saying, hey, why am I believing what I believe? Why am I spending the majority of my time and the majority of my life and all the spare finances that I have, why am I spending all of this in the church? When you start asking that question, you suddenly start realizing that there's a whole new life out there, and that there's so many inconsistencies and so many things that cause us to question, that we can start to move on. And the moment we start walking down that path, the moment we start suddenly seeing so many more things. And so it became easier and easier for me to explain away miracles and apparent answered prayers as having a very natural explanation. The supernatural started to look more like coincidence and the embellishment of facts rather than something divine. So while others around me were praising God for his goodness, I started to examine the facts, searching for the truth. And over time, these old and new disappointments, my doubts and my questions, all lent their voices to that of reason and truth. And what was once a quiet voice, which was easily stilled, had now become a strong voice that I could no longer ignore. And so my journey had begun, and I started to question everything. And that's exactly the process that people have to go through today. And you might have friends, loved ones, relatives that are strong Christians and won't listen to a word that you say. But I can tell you now, there will come a time when something will happen that will cause them to question. And it's my fervent hope that I can give you information that you will be able to share with them at that point that will cause them to ask more and more questions. So much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to doing more video experiences with you. I'm really looking forward to doing the Reverend R.J. Williams parody as well. I think you're going to really enjoy that. Getting those new books out, so thank you very much. I do have a new website. If you are interested, then go have a look at the website. It's www.ExPreacher, just with an X, preacher.com. So go check that out. There's a lot of information there about me, information about our community. I do work with a number of other great atheist friends. David McAfee's a fantastic one. My dad, of course, some of you do know him, Brian Baker. He's written many books on atheism. And he and I independently started questioning our faith. And I remember I had a conversation with him when I started questioning, saying, "Hey, Dad, I'm just starting to question these things. I don't know what your take on it is." And he's like, "Oh, finally, you've started questioning." And so it was really good. But thank you once again for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing a lot more with you in the weeks and months to come. So thank you once again. Have a great evening.